This is a short video on how to add bolt states and set them up. So just going to be very quick and show a brief overview of setting up basic state so that you can replicate things to all your clients. Go to the Bolt menu, you go to Assets, and in this case I want to delete the states I made. I have a player state. I'm going to delete it. Hold Control to be able to delete things here, and I have a GameManager state. I'm going to delete that one. And now I'm going to give it a second to rebuild, and then I'm going to re-add those states so you can see how I set them up. I already have some code, and I'm just going to very quickly add a few lines to show you how you would hook it up to your other objects. So this is replicating data in your multiplayer game. The GameManager state, its purpose is going to handle the state. You know, a lot of times you might put a player list in there. You could put a scoreboard, things like that. You could also put something in there that, in my case, I wanted something that would be connected to a state machine, and so I would make sure I replicate the game state from the server to all the clients, saying, okay, the game has begun, and now this is in the middle of the game somewhere, something happens, an event happens. You can fire events to do those things, but a state machine works really well for the game, just to know where it's at and have everyone be on the same page. An event works fine too, but it's a state machine is superior for handling this, you know, that kind of natural progression. Okay, so I deleted those things. Right click on an empty space here, say new state. First I'm going to show the player state, so I add one called player state, and this is pretty basic. I'm going to add a new one called transform. This is something you need pretty much for any character in your game that's replicated. Set it to be transform. So transform. You can pick another name. It doesn't matter. Then the next step is going to be getting what you can see in the background there, which is my animations. I want my animator controller. So the animations are replicated. You drag your controller and put it here in the import mechanism parameter spot. And once you're there, you click. I'm going to add one more property before I do this, because they're all going to get appended to the end. I'm going to put the health, just as a simple example. And I'll show you how to add a callback when the health changes, so you can set the health on the player too. So I have the transform, that's important, pretty basic on any Bolt entity, and then a health. So these properties will be different depending on what it is you want to update and replicate for that particular object. And then I'm going to use the import to import all the mechanism parameters from that controller. As you can see, it's added all these bools and triggers from my animator. And I'm going to close that window. That's it for that one. I'm going to add another state. It's called GameManager state. And I'm going to go ahead and call it GameState, because it's not going to go in this GameManager. It's going to be something that I'm going to create right when the scene loads, because what I have in the background there is what I call bootstrap scene, and it loads up some of the things, the other scenes I need. Like I separate my game UI into a different scene, and so I kind of load those up, and I set the objects to be do not destroy. So, and then later Bolt is the one that actually creates the scenes. Of course, when you're doing multiplayer game, you call Bolt, it's the one that when you join a game, it's the one that actually creates the scene, so you don't actually have to do that. Bolt knows that you want the same scene for all the players. I'm going to add a new property, and it's going to be current state. This is going to map to an enum, so I'm just going to make it an integer type. That's going to be very easy to map between all the game objects. And that is it. So I have something called GameState. Now this is important. Save and compile Bolt. Now what Bolt is doing is generating interfaces for you in the background. So it's generating C# code. So until you've compiled, if we go and add those C# files and start doing what we need to do to get this to work, to hook up the state behavior, everything won't have a proper reference. It'll get an error. It'll show it, in red, saying that it doesn't know what PlayerState is. So it's important. Make sure you compile. Close the window. I have some code there, so I also decided to name it differently this time. Once we've done that, the next step is I added a Bolt subfolder in my scripts folder, so you might want to do that too. And then I already created the player state behavior. That's the name for it. I'm going to go ahead and delete this one because I gave it a new name, so this is going to run you through exactly how to create one. Give it a second to recompile. And so immediately after you've created your state, you're good, but you need to create a behavior to hook it up. So now I create my game state behavior. And let's go edit that. It's going to take a second to recompile. Okay. I have my default mono behavior here, and I want to make it into a bolt. It's a entity behavior, and it needs a type. The type is going to be iGameState. So that's exactly the line you need, depending on the name that you give it. If it's GameState, it would be iGameState. If it's PlayerState behavior, it would be iPlayerState. Again, you could name it something else. I don't have the U there, so this is not necessarily important, but the first thing that we'll need to do is add it is an override for attached. See, in Visual Studio, it knew about the inherited overrideable methods. So now here in the behaviors, there's already a variable called state that we've inherited. So in this case, I have a state.currentState. It's right there. It's an integer. This is what's going to be updated and replicated, but it's up to you to take that and put it on the objects that need to be affected. So now in the tutorials, they show you addressing these values directly, like getting the state behavior component and then getting current state directly from it and modifying it directly. And that is fine, and I think that's probably a nice way to handle it. But you're going to have plenty of times where you declare a property here and you need to do some other things, and it's not necessarily mapped to one-to-one. So you can do a lot of things with whatever you put in your state. So in this case, I'm going to have another object, and I wanted to demonstrate how to set up the callbacks, because really that's more flexible anyway. So you can add a callback. You have to put the string here, so I'm going to call it current state, and that does have to be exactly the same. And then I need the callback, so it's going to be on current state change. That's just a naming convention that's pretty common. And then I simply add a void on current state changed method. So there we go. Everything's green. Current state, that's the name of the property. It has to be exactly the same. Now in here, that is where I would get my other GameState object. And I haven't decided exactly what that's going to be, but an example would be FindObjectOfType GameState. Now, FindObjectOfType is very slow. It's not performant, so you would want to probably implement the Unity Singleton pattern. so that you're doing something like GameState.Instance and then setting its current state, something like that. Again, the tutorial shows you just using these directly, and that is a good method, is attaching this to that object, and I think I'll show that. So, but that's an example of maybe setting on another object. So I'm going to switch back, and I have a player state behavior. I've already typed this out. Again, the entity behavior, it does inherit from mono behavior, so and these are going to be attached to objects, so they will get awake and start events. So here I added the attached, and then in this case, for the player state, that property called transform is a network transform class. So it's not just an int or something else that we want to set somewhere else or change. It has a method. It's called change transforms, and you just point it to the current transform of the object. Again, this player state behavior is going to be attached to our player directly, so our context is the transform. That'll be the correct one. So that will replicate the transform. Calling change transforms, that will already set it up. You don't have to add a callback or anything. Alright, so the next is animations. Again, there's already a method here to do that. So all I do is I get the component in children, the animator, and then I call state.setAnimator with the get component in children animator. That set animator already is going to set things up so that it's pointing to the animator, and that the properties are going to be set back and forth and replicated to all the other clients. So the other thing I did add is the health, and I have not added a callback. Again, the tutorial shows using a player state and accessing the health directly from whatever your player class is on your player object. And again, that's perfectly good. In most cases, if you're doing, you would want to make sure that only the owner is setting the properties on this state, and the only person that can set properties is going to be an owner. So you might have some code where you need to say if is owner and make sure that only the owner is changing the health. So here I'm going to add state dot add a callback. And it's going to be on health, and I call it on health changed. Go down here. I already have it here, and this is an example of where I would have a player object, and then I would set his health, the player's health. I would set to the state.health, and then of course, since the health is being updated, it might be less than 0 or less than equal to 0, and the player might die. So this check health, that would be a method that would then go through, make sure the health is if it's less than equal to 0, then I would play a die animation and trigger whatever I need to do for a player death. Very common. Again, this was something I had before, and this is an example. Maybe you'd have a property here on the player state for the name of the player, and if someone changed it, you wanted, because I would be displaying it in the UI somewhere, and so if they were to go to some screen and rename their player somehow, it would be updated on the screen. And again, it's a callback. You can do whatever you want. Here I was getting some actor component somewhere, and then setting the screen name on the actor to be the player name. Alright. So I'm going to comment that back out because I'm not using that right at this moment. I will need that. And we need to go back, and now we need to attach the behaviors to prefabs. Give it a second to compile. And I need to find my player. Here it's called player local. Open the prefab. And he's already set up. I already have the Bolt entity on there. But because I deleted and re-added the state, now it's not assigned. So in this case, you wouldn't have the bolt entity here. You would need to add it to your prefab, your player prefab. Then pick the state, it's iPlayerState, and then attach the player state behavior. This is important. That script we just created, it needs to be attached on here because it is a mono behavior and it needs to be on something. The network callbacks and the script, the code that you write in there, those you do not attach the network callbacks.cs as shown in the tutorial. That does not get attached anywhere. It's not about, it does not inherit from mono behavior. It's not meant to be attached. So anyways, I've done that there. That is set up in Bolt when there's going to be a place in your network callbacks, probably in on local scene load, on local load done. You're probably going to instantiate a player there or something, and you're going to go through the BoltPrefabs dot. So you're just say BoltPrefabs dot player local in this case, because Bolt knows about all these prefabs. So I added it on here. Once I've added that, you need to make sure you update the Bolt prefab database. So you go to Bolt, update prefab database. I'm going to add one more because I do need this. I don't need it right at this moment, but I'm going to go ahead and add it. And this is going to be for my GameState. I'm just going to create one called GameState. I really go with the managers for things that stay around, and maybe I'll just go with GameStateManager. Now I'm going to create it here, but it's going to be a prefab, so it's going to be instantiated along with when the scene is loaded with the first player. If it were the server and the scene were loaded and there were no players, I would still want to instantiate it. So I'm going to create an empty game object. I'm going to delete it later from the scene because I don't want it in this scene. This is a bootstrap scene that gets loaded early before Bolt is even initialized. And then this scene does some other things where it steps through and loads, does what it needs to either connect or run as a server. So I'm going to call it GameStateManager. And then I'm going to attach the GameState behavior, also the GameStateManager that we created, which is blank right now. It doesn't do anything, but this is just to show. We also definitely need the Bolt entity. I'm going to move that up. So I usually have the entity and below it the behavior, so I can tell right away it's missing. And this is going to be iGameState. And once this is hooked up, again, this you could have. I added a current state integer that would map to an enum. You could add the list of players. You could add anything you want. And I'm going to put this in my prefabs, and I'm going to delete it from the scene. See, it says prefab lookup not valid, prefab ID 0. So I'll delete it from the scene because I don't really want it in that scene. I just wanted to build a prefab. Now the prefab exists along with the player, but it still shows a warning if I open the prefab. Once you've done this, you need to go here and update the prefab database. So once anything you attach a Bolt entity to, and then you need to update the prefab database. And that's all. At this point, you have state on an object, and that state is going to be replicated. Those properties you added are being replicated to all the other clients. The only thing that you need to watch for is changing the properties can only be done by the owner. So whoever created that player local, when I instantiated it with Bolt Network, and I said BoltPrefabs.PlayerLocal, and I instantiated it, that's the owner. And Only he can change those state values. If someone else tries to change the value, nothing's going to happen. If I get the player state of another player in the game and set dot health to equal to something, it simply won't change. You'll probably get an error warning in the console. So only the owner can make changes to the state, whoever created that object. That's all there is.